talking literally about just white squares that are arranged one after another.
The grid as a kind of brilliant, massive underlying structure or scaffold or container that is capable of holding so much and being so large and so small while actually being technically nothing at all.
What's really interesting about scaffolded attention is that it introduces this possibility that there's this whole category of things in our everyday experiences that are mind-dependent, such that without the mind, they wouldn't be there. Hi, I'm Joan. I'm currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Yale Perception Cognition Lab, and I study everyday hallucinations. What is my experience of scaffolded attention? It's when I look at bathroom tiles or even the windows in this office, and then I start to see things just pop out. Like I see a letter J or I see a letter F or H, and there's nothing there. It's just a regular grid, but you see them anyway, and they're really transient. It's very fleeting. We thought that, well, maybe it's because the grids lend or serve as a scaffold for attention to start creating all of these object representations. I might be experiencing it as a figure in ground, like a figure popping out from the background. In the case of scaffolded attention, what's interesting is that all of the squares should be just a background. There is no figure there. So why is it that the mind sees figures anyway start to pop out? When I'm giving a presentation, I want to get people to think, get people to wonder. And it's actually really funny because some artists actually have used grids as inspiration for their art, right? And so sometimes I'll lead with that and talk about how, okay, here is an artwork, something that you might see in the museum, and it's just grids. And yet this artist seems to want us to experience something. So what is this artist trying to tell us? That kind of gets people to wonder, that is weird. And then I can go and say, well, maybe it's because these grids actually serve as a scaffold, and so you might think they're just individual squares, but actually when you stare long enough, you begin to see all sorts of other things.
Hello, I'm Cynthia. I'm from San Jose, California, so Bay Area. Primarily, I have two real practices. One of them is my major, which is design, and my outwards-facing practice, the sort of graphic design, publication design, various other media, and so that's kind of one section. And the other one is my fine arts practice. A lot of the conceptual inspiration that I have comes from the idea of inventing a new language when you can't speak the language that dominant culture gives you. And the series of codes and keys you have to express yourself in, and what it means to, if you can't do what the art world expects of you, then how can you say what you want to say anyway? So if you take this and then you copy and paste it onto itself, and then you shrink it, and then you keep on doing that into itself, and you start to make this pattern, and it looks cool. And I was like, that looks cool. And then when you select it, each one of the shapes has its center. And when they overlap, they have their overlapping centers until they keep on overlapping. And I thought that was very interesting. Again, sort of the idea of iteration. And I was just kind of playing around with it. Of centers within centers within centers. Well, I could talk about grid art for a long time and talk about
encountered Agnes Martin because of my work on the grids, and I kind of Googled grids in museums, and then Agnes Martin came up. Her work is featured in the Guggenheim, and
they were really huge. So gigantic canvases, just with completely measured out these kind of floating lines.
These huge canvases of just grids, like just lines.
A lot of the ways that it's interpreted is sort of like this very meditative ritual to deal with life. A scaffold, not only for ideas or not only for visual perception, but of a style of living and a way of like carrying the things that she saw and felt.
I was not aware that Agnes Martin suffered from hallucinations. That was really interesting. And she would say, like, you know, yeah, sure, like there's nothing there, it's all ordinary, but then and return back to that innocence of mind, then you'll start to get what I mean.
Agnes Martin dealt for the majority of her life with various states of psychosis as a result of paranoid schizophrenia.
We started out not even talking about your experience in the grid as a hallucination, right? For us, it was just perception. I always hesitated to call it a hallucination because we typically think of hallucinations in a very clinical context. And so the idea that a big chunk of the population, I mean, 70%, 80% will experience scaffolded attention, will experience these everyday hallucinations. I think that challenges my own concept of hallucinations. And maybe that's what Agnes Martin kind of wanted too, where it was like, you know, she experiences the world in a marginal way, like is quite atypical or marginal, but maybe actually not. And maybe the grids were there to kind of encourage us to experience something that people would just take for granted otherwise.
I think that storytelling is kind of inherent in all forms of art, and sort of like more contemporary like artistic theories. It's a lot about like the art telling a story, but then the viewer also having a story for themselves and bring their own like background to meet the art halfway.
I was just running a subject 2 days ago, and I was like, can you describe a little bit your experience of scaffolded attention? And then they were like, oh, the lines of the shape that they were seeing would start to get bolder, and then all the other lines would start to get blurred. And I thought that was really interesting because I've never experienced it that way. And so I think part of what's been exciting about scaffolded attention is that just you have such different experiences, and the goal is to try to explain what might be underlying those individual differences in the first place.
When I see a grid, it's not necessarily about like the patterns that I see in it. I mean, yes, but like physiologically, I think I do see like, you know, the light and the dark, but then more of what I see is like the possibility of like a multiplicity and sort of like how it can expand or shrink in the things that it can contain. The sort of like possibility of what can go in each, and how these, you know, individual like items can become like worlds. Yeah.